Okay, good evening. It seems everyone is here, and I presume you're all able to hear. Um, your audio are fine, so we proceed from where we left off last week. I was discussing with the agriculture and economic development, and I was going to discuss with you the issue that was quite important among the original theorists in agriculture was the issue of what is called peasant rationality. Okay, now, the many of the proponents back in the 1800s of agrarian reform, such as John Stuart Mill, when he was proposing agrarian reform in Ireland and England, and also in their lands in India, their colonies in the Indian subcontinent, then of course in Russia, and they were faced with the fact that uh, there were instances when land ownership was really distributed among the peasants. And the idea behind agrarian reform is that when tenant farmers begin to own their land, then they would feel a greater sense of identification and investment in the land. And since they already own the land, there is no more need for them to worry about making rental payments to landlords. Then it would mean greater incomes for these peasant farmers. Okay? But then the peasant farmers were seen as being irrational because they did not actually maximize production for sale. They were not maximizing their money incomes. Okay, they were persisting in subsistence production, meaning to say they still persisted in production for their own consumption rather than fully devoting their production for commercial enterprises and therefore maximize their money incomes. So the peasants were regarded as being irrational. Now, in microeconomics, in neoclassical economics, when you're talking about rationality or rational behavior, it is behavior consistent with constrained maximization. Okay? So for a consumer that maximizes the utility is a function of X squiggle. X squiggle is a matrix of different goods consumed. Okay, so X1, the first row would be, say, different food items. X2, the second row would be different um, clothing, items, and so on and so forth. Subject to the budget constraint, where the budget constraint is the wage rate W times the hours of labor they supply, equal to their total expenditures, A sub I times X sub I. Quantity of each X sub I times the corresponding price plus the level of savings. So for a rational consumer, the rational behavior is to choose the number of hours of work to determine the income that he or she will earn, what goods to purchase and how much of each, and the level of savings. For a firm, okay, the firm maximizes its profit, where profit is equal to total revenue, which is a function of the total number of goods sold, R of Q, minus cost, which is a function of total goods produced, Q, subject to the constraint, which is the production function Q, equals A technology as a function of labor and capital, where the production function determines the maximum possible output that the firm can attain given the current level of technology. So the behavior, rational behavior here, is for the firm to decide what goods to produce, what's the level of production, and what the factor proportions are. And none here indicate production for their own consumption. None indicate subsistence production, which is why, based on traditional microeconomic theory, peasants were regarded as being irrational. Some of the great economics writers, including Karl Marx, in fact, have noted that the rural sector will never be the source of people wanting change, wanting to be involved in the revolution, because the rural folk were seen as being superstitious, irrational, like many development economists, however, 1950s onwards, would argue that this is the wrong set of theories to apply because these neoclassical microeconomic theories refer to what we would nowadays call a modern sector, firm or household, that is fully specialized in consumption and the supply of labor, and a modern sector firm, which is fully specialized in the production of goods and services, production and sale of goods and services, and in the hiring factors of production. And they argue that it's the wrong theories to apply to a peasant household because the peasant household is neither a modern sector household nor a modern sector firm. It is unspecialized in production and consumption. Therefore, you need to develop a theory that deals with this particular issue. That this is one of the original theories in 1950s development economics. And you have here the development by Schultz of the theory of the rational maximizing peasant, where he decided to put in effectively a two-tier utility function. Two-tier meaning to say two levels. Okay. The first level being that the the peasant household would maximize its utility as a function of Z's or Z's. Z is the British pronunciation, letter Z. Every Z or every Z sub I would be different items that enter into the utility function. So for Z sub 1, you have Z sub 1, Z sub 2, and like these are different food items that they purchase, and labor and land, which is labor and land that they will devote to the production of food for their own consumption. Okay. The next tier is the constraint. For a peasant household, their main constraint is family labor time, L sub B, and the family land. So the family labor time will be allocated to L sub BC, which is family labor time to produce cash crops, crops that they can sell for money income. Then L sub BS, family labor time used in the production of food items for their own subsistence. And L sub BW, which is family labor in earning money wage. Okay. So usually, say during off harvest and off planting seasons when there is no need for so much labor in the fields, okay, family members might go to the towns, to the cities for short-term employment and then earn a wage to add on to the family's cash resources. Okay? Now, the land will be allocated between L sub DC, land for the production of cash crops, and L sub DS, land for the production of food items for their own subsistence. So given this utility function, where the utility is a combination of items that they purchase plus items that they themselves will produce for their own consumption, by this utility function, it will be clear that the behavior consistent with this constrained maximization problem is to decide in the product list what sort of output to produce, the output level of each, and the factor proportions, the proportions of labor and land for their production, which, if you look closely, is no different from the rational behavior expected of modern sector firms. So we have identified a constrained maximization problem and what would be the behavior that would be considered rational being consistent with this constrained maximization problem. Okay. Still, it does not explain why would peasants still find it necessary to engage in in subsistence production. One of the things in social science to consider is that whenever a behavior persists over time, then it's regarded as being rational. So there must be some rationality behind it. One has to truly identify the constrained maximization behavior. So here we have it, but it still does not explain why peasants would still persist in subsistence production rather than devoting all their family labor and land production for the sale of cash crops and therefore maximize their money. This is important because land and resources used by peasant farmers for subsistence production actually reduces on the available supply of food to the towns and cities. So that's why it's important to address the issue. Why do peasants persist in subsistence production? Why don't they just devote their entire resources towards maximizing output, selling them? Now, modern utility theory developed 1930s and became widespread by the 1970s as developed by, say, Kelvin Lancaster and the like, argued that first is there might be a need to redefine what utility is a function of, because traditionally from Alfred Marshall, when he developed the modern theory of the consumer, utility was seen as a function of goods consumed. Now, when you now talk of modern utility theory, rather than utility is a function of goods consumed, he argued that one should see utility more as a function of attributes. So, for example, if one were to see utility as a function of goods, therefore, an individual would be maximizing utility if, let us say, he purchases a private car. However, if one were to see utility as a function of attribute, as say, utility is a function of mobility, the ability to be able to move around. So, not purchasing a private car still be considered rational because in this instance, the person would rather just take mass transit, just so that there'll be greater mobility for him. So that's the first thing. Okay. So again, for people who say they want to diet and reduce on their food consumption, in all their theory, that would be seen as not uh, rational because they're reducing on their utility by reducing the quantity of goods that they consume. But if you redefine it as a function of proper nutrition, then yes, uh, reducing one's food intake could be seen as rational behavior as well. Okay. So that's the first. Consider the Z's here as essentially attributes, not specific goods. So Z sub 1 can be seen as nutrition. Z sub 2 can be seen as, say, clothing and shelter, so on and so forth. And more importantly, you now have here the incorporation of risk, sigma. Okay, sigma, as you know from statistics, is the symbol for standard deviation. And in economics, especially, for example, in the financial literature, sigma, it's also used as a symbol for risk and uncertainty. Because if, let's say, you're talking here about riskiness or volatility of, say, a stock, okay? So one will get its average price for several years, and then one can measure its standard deviation. And clearly, if you compare it with other stocks, those with higher sigma would be seen as being more risky assets because of their greater volatility is measured by their level of risk, the sigma. So now when you incorporate risk, what this means is that the utility function and or the profit maximizing function would equal utility as a function of attributes consumed for given level of risk. Now, traditional utility and firm behavior theories have always assumed what is called a one-to-one correspondence between action and desired consequence. Okay, so what this means is, for example, when one's action is to eat a burger, the desired consequence is to satisfy one's hunger. So that effectively, when one eats a burger, it is assumed that that automatically translates to the satisfaction of one's hunger. But then, once you put in risk, there's no longer a one-to-one correspondence between action and a desired consequence because you now have the entry of what is known as the unknown state of the world. Okay? So, for example, if your action is you'd like to bring your umbrella with, then desired consequence is to remain dry. If there is what's known as perfect certainty, you would know if you will need an umbrella or not. But then in real life, you have uncertainty. So your action is to bring or not to bring an umbrella. There's the unknown state of the world. Say, if it's going to rain. Okay? So if you bring an umbrella and it doesn't rain, you dry. If you bring an umbrella and it rains, then you will be not very wet. It's called you dry. Now, if you don't bring an umbrella and it does not rain, you're dry. But if you don't bring an umbrella and it rains, then you're wet. So effectively, there no longer is that one-to-one correspondence between the action and the desired consequence. Okay? Which is why certain actions are done, even if there is a certain level of risk. And in this particular analysis, the explanation as to why peasant farmers persist in, in subsistence production is that the idea is that you do have inadequate infrastructure in the rural areas. Okay? Many rural areas don't have the regular transport access or communications access with the rest of the markets. They could be far away. So therefore, what this means is um, the markets in the rural areas might not always have the necessary goods that peasants would want, such as food, clothing, and the like, because of the inadequacy of the infrastructure. Rural markets are not always stocked with a lot of goods. And that's why the argument is this is the reason why peasants persist in subsistence production. It's rational because there is no guarantee that the things that they'd like to purchase are always available in markets, given that rural markets are plagued by inadequate infrastructure links. Okay, right. So this is how we deal with behavior by redeveloping modern theory and developing a theory dealing with the peculiar circumstances of peasant households as having and combining features of a modern sector firm and a modern sector house. So now I'll just go over a number of major issues which you can read up on just to understand issues on agriculture and economic development. The first has to do with the environment. Agriculture, more than all the other sectors, is one sector that is severely affected by the environment. And this is especially since the 1960s, they developed highly productive technologies in production of wheat and rice, for example. So, like in the 1960s, with the so-called Green Revolution, you have this massive increase in rice production, rice out and the like throughout the world. But by the 1990s or so, productivity began to slow down. And it seems like it would be because of the environmental impact that these new rice varieties may have had that ended up compromising the natural fertility of, of soils. For example, the Green Revolution required substantial irrigation, and traditional rice irrigation systems would be flood rice fields, and then that, that evaporation dry the rice fields once it's time for harvest. The thing is, when it's done for decades, the evaporation leaves with it the salts in the soil, okay? And therefore increasing the salinity of soils and therefore diminishing their natural fertility. The same also has to do with the use of a wide range of inorganic pesticides and fertilizers, which have destroyed a lot of habitats, may have increased output, but in the long run have begun to compromise once more the integrity of farmlands. And so that's why focus lately has been on developing farm technologies that minimize environmental damage and in fact enhance or take advantage of natural capabilities of the soils and the like. So they're developing, for example, more efficient agricultural systems, like the drip irrigation system that was developed in Israel, okay? Rather than flooding the fields with water, you have underground pipes which are buried under the soil, and the pipes feed water directly to the roots of plants. So there isn't much water goes to the surface, but the water goes directly to the roots of your rice, your food, everything. Right? Then you also have the use of natural pesticides and natural fertilizers. You have, for example, farm technologies in Thailand, right, where they let ducks in the fields. Ducks then eat the weeds and a lot of the pests and the like, keeping ice fields free of pests. Then there are those who culture fish in the flooded fields when they're irrigated, and then the fish are the ones that eat a lot of the insects and other pests. So they're the natural pesticides. And what will happen is that in addition to rice, they could also have duck meat as well as a lot of fish, supplement their food and their income earnings. So these have been the focus of a lot of research, especially since in many ways, when you talk of the effect of the environment, oftentimes the effect appears years afterwards, years and years, and they're not easily immediately identified. So, for example, back in the 1960s, when you had a lot of children in Japan being deformed, it was then that they realized that that's because their mothers had been eating a lot of fish caught in the waters in Japan, where the fish had high levels of mercury that were thrown into the sea by mining companies. Since after all, that was always been the tradition of human beings, as we discussed last week, to use the seas as dumping grounds. So with high levels of mercury among the fish and a lot of women eating this heavily mercury contaminated fish. As it turns out, one of its side effects was the damage to the eggs, so that there were lots of children born in Japan with deformities, and it turns out to be one of the long-term consequences of mercury poisoning. So this is an area of intensive research. It's mostly the work of scientists, but economists, of course, enter into the picture to check and see what would be the yield and the costs of these new, more environmentally sustainable technologies of production and what their necessary infrastructure requirements would be in terms of irrigation systems and the use of certain natural pesticides and herbicides, fertilizers, and the like. It is said, for example, that China attained high levels of productivity in rice centuries ago because China developed a system where in their towns and cities, so you'd have people who were collecting the organic wastes from households, and these organic wastes were being used as fertilizer in farms, and that's why the Chinese agriculture was said to have attained high levels of production and productivity. So they're able to get higher yields on rice, and therefore it would explain the high levels of population that China attained centuries ago, largely because of their understanding of how organic wastes of human beings are able to actually act as an excellent fertilizer. Nowadays, for example, that's the preferred form of fertilizer, organic wastes, and which unfortunately it is said that it has side effect, which is that when fields are fertilized with organic wastes and the like, when rains fall, the rains seep through the soil and they pass through that level filled with organic wastes and the like, it would end up affecting the taste of the groundwater. That's the reason why it is said that in China, because of the peculiar taste of the water, that's why they developed one, they developed the tradition of boiling their water regularly. And China could do it because they could easily obtain coal. Coal was plenty in China and very, very accessible, even to far-flung communities. But in addition to boiling the water, they also ended up developing a taste for tea. The tea leaves being able to mask the foul taste of their water from wells. Anyway, then next we have the issue here of agrarian reform. Okay. As I discussed with you a while ago, you have oftentimes a lot of argumentation about the importance of agrarian reform as a means for developing greater equity in the ownership of assets and therefore greater equity in process of economic development. So lots of countries have implemented agrarian reform. The Philippines being one of them. Philippines began its agrarian reform way back in the 1960s, and we're still doing it. But when you talk about agrarian reform, if the criteria would be increase in food supply, increase in GNP per capita, and increase in employment, it is said that the most successful agrarian reform programs since the end of World War II were the ones implemented in Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. These countries implemented agrarian reform, and they later on gained high levels of food production, increase in GNP per capita, and an increase in rural employment incomes. So these were among the features of the successful agrarian reform program. First was that before agrarian reform was announced and implemented, these countries already had updated cadastral surveys. A cadastre is a map that indicates private property locations and the limits. So the map indicates, for example, this particular area, we have these different properties and who owns are. So since these cadastral surveys were updated before they began the agrarian reform, they had the necessary database to identify which were the farmlands and where they're located, their size, and the owner, so that they would know that these farmlands can then be subdivided among different uh, beneficiaries. The next characteristic was that the agrarian reform program was implemented reasonably rapidly within 4 or 5 years, which is seen as being very, very important. Because the sooner that land is redistributed and therefore the ownership issue is well established, then after that, it can now begin to attract more investments in agriculture. One of the problems of many countries like the Philippines is agrarian reforms ongoing and ongoing in these decades is that in many places the redistribution of lands have not been completed yet. Some have not even been started, which is why it deters possible investments because of the uncertainty over the ownership of the land and eventually ownership of future earnings in farmlands. In South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, they were able to complete land distribution within 4 to 5 years. Third was that the land was converted from being a real estate asset to a financial asset. In order to compensate landowners, one of the big problems of agrarian reform law in the Philippines is that compensation was set in cash, which therefore means government ended up with the problem of uh, trying to generate sufficient cash reserves for the compensation of landlords. But what Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan did was rather than provide cash, they issued bonds, government bonds, which means that they will be paid by government over time and they'll be financed by future taxes. So effectively, for many landowners, their asset simply changed character from owning the land as a real estate, as an asset. It was converted to a financial asset. Their compensation was in the form of bonds, which were earning assets. You know. So it therefore preserved a lot of the assets of a lot of landlords. And therefore landlords can now pursue other business enterprises given the earnings that they were realizing from the payment of bonds. Then you have landlord and farmer organizations. They had well organized landlord and farmer organizations, which made it easy to identify the lands that can be redistributed and who the beneficiaries were among the farmers. That's why they could very rapidly transfer ownership. Whereas in many countries like here in the Philippines, there are lots of instances where they weren't sure who the beneficiaries would be for the land that's going to be distributed. Then the next issue has to do with the issue of international trade. Okay. There's the issue here of what is called food security. Traditionally, food security meant that a country should be able to produce its own food requirements as much as possible, produce its own food. The idea being that doing so would assure that the country has a regular supply of its own food items. Even if, let us say, by comparative advantage, the food might actually be more cheaply produced elsewhere. And the country might as well just specialize in producing something else rather than guaranteeing its own food supply so that it can just import its food requirements elsewhere. Japan, for example, does not follow that logic. It supports its rice farmers to the hill with very, very high domestic purchasing prices for rice. And it said that's the reason why There are rice lands even within the um, the boundaries of Tokyo because rice lands earn a lot, given that there are very high domestic prices of rice. And the purpose is to really encourage Japanese rice farmers to keep on increasing their production and therefore assure Japan its own rice supply. Okay. But there are countries who didn't mind uh, importing their food requirements, like the United Kingdom. Since the 1800s, the abolition of the Corn Laws, as engineered by David Ricardo, England has been a largely food importing country also, just the same as Sweden. And that, in fact, is one of the major issues attached to the issue of Brexit, because the European countries like France, Spain, Italy were really providing subsidies to their own local farm producers, and they would impose tariffs on food imports. So England is a major um, payer of import tariffs because a lot of the food is imported. England, of course, had problems like in World War II, obtaining their necessary food supplies because they were importing from elsewhere. In terms of food security, what England did is not so much to just import food, but actually encourage British investment in foreign food production. So it's actually British firms, for example, that own and produce tea from the tea plantations in Malaysia and India and the like. And they also have large scale importation of potatoes and beef products from their own investments in meat processing plants and farms in Argentina. So, so that's how they deal with issue international. Wait, just as China, for example, has bought a lot of rice lands in Australia, in Thailand, and Cambodia, essentially to ensure its access to sufficient food output coming from these countries which are land rich. Okay. Now here in the Philippines, we've already tarified rice imports and therefore effectively liberalized the importation of rice. Okay. In the long run, it's supposed to encourage greater efficiencies among our rice farms. So you will see how this is going to play out, especially with the fact that tarification effectively meant that we are now engaged in greater food importation. And therefore, it would be necessary then to have the necessary funds in order to pay for regular foods. Then another major issue as far as agriculture and food is concerned would be the issue of market changes. Traditionally, you have argument that the problem insofar as food is not in terms of food production. We actually have a huge output of food throughout the world. The problem is in the food distribution, in essentially the market signals as far as food is concerned. And this is because when when people start attaining higher levels of incomes, they begin to develop a demand for more and more meat products. Okay? So whereas before, at generally lower levels of income, much of the food requirements are largely grains and vegetables and the like. But once you have people moving to higher levels of income, they begin to increase their demand for meat and meat products as well as seafoods. Like, what this means is that a lot of the food which are being produced as food which can already be considered food, such as grains, corn, rice, and the like, they're actually being produced and sold not so much as food, but as feed. So there's a large portion. So it's just like my previous discussion before about goods with various use values, which is why their demand increases quite rapidly. And it is that when you're talking about a lot of these food items, the vegetables, the grains, rice grains, wheat, barley, oats, and the like, which already are food, a lot of these are being grown to become feed for animals. Okay. So therefore, the prices of these food items, therefore, are much higher than what they should have been if they were all completely devoted to directly providing food for human beings. But no, a large portion is now being grown and harvested to become feed for animal products, both land animals and marine products, given the increasing demand for meat and products. And the third major use value for these food items from the past 10, 15 years is that a lot of these grains, these food items, the corn and the like, can actually also be used to produce fuel, biofuels, especially given the very, very high prices of petroleum back in uh, the late 2000s. Okay, the there was a switch to biofuels, fuels, which come from grain products and the like, from corn and the like. So effectively, again, food prices went up because you have a huge demand for a lot of these food items as food, as feed, and as fuel. And that's why you do have this distribution issue where the prices of these food items have gone up higher than what they should have been because they're also being purchased as feed and as fuel. Okay? So these are among the issues with regards to agriculture and economic development. The next topic, closely related to agriculture and total economic development, the issue of migration and urbanization. So at this point, I will just have our regular 10-minute break. So I will see you in the 10 minutes, okay? All right, let's start, okay? Now, we are going over now the issue of migration and urbanization, okay? Now, one of the characteristics of a developed economy is that it is they are dominantly urban countries. Okay? So about 80% at least on average of populations in the high income countries would be living in urban areas. Okay? Whereas in many developing countries, the proportion is much lower, which does indicate that a still large um, traditional sector or a feudal sector over in the rural areas. Here in the Philippines, the urbanization rate is roughly 60 to 70%. Depends on how you identify. how you identify. But okay, China is about also 50, 60. India is about 40%. So you can imagine if these two countries become developed in the next 30 to 40 years, the billions of people who will be migrating from the rural to the urban areas in these countries will be quite something. So urbanization is a characteristic of economic development. But the issue facing developing countries nowadays is that of rapid urbanization. Many of the developed countries in Europe and North America took quite some time, a couple of decades for them to become urbanized, which meant that they had time to adapt and develop their cities, the infrastructure of their cities, and the like. But for many developing countries, the phenomenon has been rapid urbanization. They've been urbanizing in such a very, very short period of time because of large scale migration from the rural to the urban areas. Okay. Now, when you're talking of rapid urbanization, social costs would be first, there's the lag demand for urban infrastructure, meaning to say a lag demand means this demand keeps on increasing and increasing over time. Demand for transport, communication services, energy, water, demand for sanitation systems, and demand for housing in the urban areas. And they keep on increasing over time. So the steady increase in urban populations because of the steady migration from the rural to the urban areas. And this would also mean a lag demand for social services. With more and more people migrating urban areas, you now have greater demand for schooling, for health facilities, and housing. And these items require space. And that's one of the problems of urban areas, the diminishing available supply of space. Given that you have restricted areas in towns and cities, and you have larger and larger numbers of people migrating to these towns and cities, so we have this huge demand for space. And many of the infrastructure and social services where the demand is increasing are things which require space. Space for your transport systems, where to place your electric power lines, your water supply systems, your sewers, your telecom lines, your wireless towers, and the like. Thus, there would be need for space for educational facilities, health facilities, and housing. And with increasing congestion, you have traditional urban problems like greater urban unemployment, the emergence of the informal sector, open poverty, and of course, criminality and the spread of disease. Okay? When you're in a situation with very, very high population density, like in many slum communities, in many informal settlements, okay, disease can spread very rapidly, such as right now when we're talking about the pandemic. The virus spreads very, very easily in close places, and which is common among the highly congested areas of Metro Manila and other cities here in the Philippines. But there are some social benefits to rapid urbanization. Rapid urbanization means that you now have a greater concentration of labor supply in towns and cities. So therefore, in towns and cities, investors can always find the necessary skills that they're looking for in large numbers. You have lots of people moving or staying in the towns and cities. Then they become a market. More and more people being concentrated in very, very few areas means that you now have a well-defined market. Therefore, in addition to being able to attract investors that can attract laborers, can also attract investors because they have the market for their goods and services right here, cities. And it is said that atmosphere areas can be a stimulus to innovation and entrepreneurship, especially among the younger segments of the population. Now, in fact, when we're talking here about the long-term prospects of demography and global population has begun to decrease, okay, one of the issues that a number of demographers and development authors are wondering would be given that the population is diminishing over the next couple of decades and therefore the lesser and lesser of numbers and proportion younger people, they begin to wonder if it might result in a problem of encouraging greater innovation and creativity because these are characteristic of younger populations and the numbers and proportion of younger people are expected to diminish in the next couple of decades. But in any case, when more and more of them live in towns and cities will end up acting as a stimulus for innovation, entrepreneurship, and the like. Now, one of the original development economics models would be the model developed by William Arthur Lewis, where he said that he was the one who first proposed and argued that the characteristic of developing economies is that they are dualistic. They have a modern and a traditional sector. The traditional sector is definitely rural, definitely agricultural. Characteristic is that it has a huge supply of surplus population. The population is in such a huge supply that the wage is practically approaching zero given this huge surplus of population in the rural areas. Meanwhile, the modern sector is dominantly urban, very much into manufacturing. It's more capital intensive in its technology. And in the urban areas, there is a legislated minimum wage, which is why, in the case of the Lewis model for Professor Lewis, is presented this as the marginal product of labor curve in manufacturing. And the marginal product of labor curve, as you know, is defined as demand for labor. The supply of labor is perfectly elastic because of the assumption of this huge surplus of laborers available, many of them coming to the rural areas. So the labor supply curve is perfectly elastic at the industrial wage level. At the subsistence wage, which is much smaller than the industrial wage, you have a lower wage, but still perfectly elastic. And Professor Lewis has said that if you look at this, okay, the total output, therefore, the modern manufacturing sector would be at this point here, up to point P, you have these two areas, this triangle and this rectangle here. And this is the total output for manufacturing, which should be divided into two segments here, the total wages paid, and over here, the total profit. And Professor Lewis suggested the profits be reinvested in manufacturing which will therefore cause the demand for labor in manufacturing to increase. And this increase in employment from M to M1 would be absorbed by the laborers coming from the rural areas. And the argument is that if you keep on reinvesting the profits in manufacturing, so it will keep on shifting so that more and more labor will be utilized in the manufacturing sector, and more of these laborers will be a lot of those coming from the rural areas and migrating to the towns and cities. Okay. The turning point happens when the surplus population disappears. So now, with the disappearance of the surplus population up to this point here, the labor supply curve now begins to increase, indicating that you now have a scarcity of labor, and therefore the wage would have to go up because you now have this increasing demand for labor. And as for the supply of labor, the surplus population has disappeared. They all have found jobs in the towns and cities. Okay. So you have a smaller available labor supply from the rural areas in order to attract them. Okay. You need now to offer a higher wage. So now the wage goes up. So whereas before the profits would be at this level C up to there, now the profit will be less because the wage has now gone up. So this model by Lewis was very, very influential. It established the notion of dualism and the like, but it assumed that there will be surplus labor and that in agriculture and that they would always be able to produce the necessary food requirements of towns and cities. Now, in 1967, Gustav Ranis and John Fay, professors at Yale University, now developed the agricultural model to supplement the Lewis model, which is focused on manufacturing sector. And here they say, okay, we have here the total output in agriculture, which reaches a certain maximum and then just more or less remains the same, doesn't change much. That's because you have here the from Q onwards, the surplus laborers with zero marginal product. So that therefore the total output curve remains more or less the same if you keep on hiring, and more laborers from Q to P. Now, here, this is the total output, which increases at the start and then begins to increase but at a slower rate and reaches the maximum point N, and then it remains there at that level. And that's because of diminishing returns. From Q to P, that would be your surplus leaves. Now, if one were to draw a diagonal from here to there, what you get is this diagonal would have a slope whose slope is total agricultural surplus, which is this, the total output of agriculture divided by the total labor population. So therefore, the slope of this diagonal line is effectively agricultural wage, which is the total output of agriculture divided by population there. And the output of agriculture, of course, is food. Okay. Now, if you look at the point, like here, and okay, the total output is the vertical distance from the x-axis up to the total product. And the total output can be divided into two, from here to there, which is the total wages paid, and from here to there, which is the total agricultural surplus, which is the total food supply available to be sent to the towns and cities. Now, if one were to draw a tangent point at the agricultural total output curve, where this tangent point is on a line that is parallel to the diagonal. Therefore, it would have the same slope, and therefore it would indicate again wage in agriculture. What we have is at this point of tangency, you have here the maximum total agricultural surplus. So the difference, the vertical distance from the total output curve to the wage curve or the average agricultural surplus curve, it's at its maximum. So that would be the maximum available food supply. So therefore, the curve identifies three general types of agricultural laborers, from Q up to P over here, which would be the surplus laborers. They do not add any margin. Then from here up to there, these are your marginal workers, meaning to say they have positive marginal products, but it's diminishing. And from here, 0 up to there, you have here the efficient workers. These are the workers with the highest marginal product. And then therefore, Professor Feinranes would argue that from the Lewis perspective, the ones that would be moving to the towns and cities in search of jobs would be these surplus laborers. And the efficient laborers are the ones here. Now, the interaction is such that over time, okay, you begin with the agriculture labor supply curve. Once all of the surplus and the marginal laborers have moved to the towns and cities, then the labor supply curve actually starts to begin to shift upwards. The shift actually begins from point T when all the surplus laborers have moved to the towns and cities. And beyond this, you're now talking here about trying to get marginal workers in agriculture to move to the towns and cities. But the marginal workers in agriculture are now paid a positive wage because though their marginal product is still positive, which is why to encourage them to move to the towns and cities, the wage offer has to go up. And so once the surplus and margin workers have migrated to the towns and cities, if manufacturing needs more laborers, it will now have to offer an even higher wage because they now have to get efficient laborers, now the ones with the highest pay, to move to the towns and cities. And with increasing wage, the available amount of funds, the profit in the manufacturing sector would begin to diminish because you now have increasing wage. So there is actually much less available funds for further investment in manufacturing. So that's why The Fay-Ranis model therefore argues that uh, for long-term economic development, one also needs to provide for investment in agriculture. So there'll be investment not just in manufacturing, but also in agriculture. Because when you have investment in agriculture, it will cause this curve to shift upwards. And the upward shift would mean that the tangency point will be moving from here up to there. So you'll have a much greater output level while utilizing lesser efficient laborers if there is investment in agriculture as well. And it will also prevent wages in the urban areas from beginning to rise because of the labor shortage. And therefore, it preserves the profit rate, so there'll be more funds for further investments. So the Fayranis model effectively is supposed to be a model that argues for greater what's known as balanced growth, that you need investment in manufacturing, but you also need investment in agriculture. Otherwise, the ability of agriculture to generate and produce sufficient food supply will be diminished because if you're beginning to get these laborers, the available food supply will diminish because the maximum total agricultural surplus occurs at this point here. And if you need to attract these to move there, the maximum total agricultural surplus will diminish. So you'll have lesser food available, and therefore you'll end up with higher food prices and therefore higher wages and lesser profit in the manufacturing sector. This is the wages. Okay. So this is your Fayranis model. And that's why nowadays when you're talking about the dualist model, you discuss both the Lewis and the Fayranis model together, especially since the original Lewis model was seen as having some severe limitations. And of course, the mid model of structural dualism would be completed in the 1980s, the one that I discussed with you in the theory of dualism and the like. So now the Lewis model has become a model in the area of agriculture and migration. Now, the other important theory, insofar as urbanization and migration is concerned, would be the identification of economic forces that explain and cause migration from the rural areas to the urban areas. This is a simplified Harris to Dartmouth, developed by John Harris and Professor Michael. Now, the the father of U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris is Donald Harris, he's a known labor economist and the like. This Harris over here is John Harris. It's not no relation to Kamala Harris. And in their original article in 1967, they had a rather complicated mathematical model, the complicated graph. Right? What Professor Todaro did was to come out with a simplified model of migration. And here they're trying to explain why is it that migration continues from rural to urban areas, even when there's high unemployment in the urban areas. Now, in this highly simplified model, we have here that the total labor supply in the country is O sub A to O sub M. O sub A is the origin reference point for agricultural labor supply and demand. O sub M is the origin reference point for labor supply and demand manufacturing. Here, this curve is the labor demand in agriculture, where the wage axis is here, W sub A star W. Now here, this is the reference point for the demand for labor in manufacturing. So therefore here, this is the labor demand curve for manufacturing, which looks like a supply curve. But in this case, it still is a downward sloping demand curve because the reference point for the y-axis is over here to the right, the O sub M to M axis. So where this labor demand for agriculture and labor demand for manufacturing intersect is at point E, which determines a wage rate W star A, W star M, which means this would be the market clearing wage for agriculture and manufacturing. And at this point, when you have the same wage level in agriculture and manufacturing, labor therefore will be allocated as OA to L sub A star, which will go to agriculture, and OM to L sub M star, which is what will now go to manufacturing. So now, as they say, what if there's a legislated minimum wage, where the legislated minimum wage applies to manufacturing, and it is MW sub M, the legislated minimum wage. So at this legislated minimum wage, the demand for labor in manufacturing will be up to L sub M. But the thing is, for those in the rural areas, when there was an increase in the minimum wage, it was thought that there's a huge demand for labor in the urban areas. So you now have graph Q prime, which is what is to be called the perceived demand curve for labor in manufacturing. In other words, what people in the rural areas thought that the demand for labor in the manufacturing would be, that it would be this one higher than what this one is because you have the increase in minimum wage. And this perceived demand, okay, intersects the agriculture labor demand at point Z, where this time the agricultural wage is a little higher. So what happens is, because of this perceived demand for labor shifting, we therefore have migration of people from the rural to the urban areas. And the Harris-Todaro model argues that the reason for that is there will always be migration from the rural to the urban areas for as long as there is a difference between the actual agricultural wage and the expected wage in the manufacturing sector, where the expected wage in the manufacturing sector can be measured by the minimum wage times the probability of landing a job. And a way to measure the probability of landing a job is to use the employment rate. So for as long as the employment rate times the minimum wage remains higher than the agricultural wage, so for as long as the expected urban wage is higher than the actual agricultural wage, there will always be migration from the rural to the urban areas, even when you still have unemployment in the urban areas. So equilibrium happens at the point Z, where Employment in agriculture is from OA to L sub A at a higher level of wage, W sub A. Employment in manufacturing, okay, is from OM to LM at the minimum wage, MW sub M. And LA to LM is the unemployment in the urban areas. So the high unemployment rate in the urban areas, therefore, the expected urban wage decreases to the level where the expected urban wage now equals the actual agricultural wage. So at this point, you now have equilibrium and migration stops. So this is the most popular, most widely used economic theory of migration. There are very many other theories that try to explain the migration decision. Many of them are sociological and psychological in nature. You have the push-pull factors about the migration decision is a decision that is due confluence of push factors, which are factors in origin, and pull factors, which are factors in the country of destination. The Harris-Tudara model has also been used to understand international migration, where this time it's not the difference between agricultural and manufacturing wage, but it would be more the wage of one country versus the wage of another. And the usual measurement for overall wage is the GNI per capita. So they look at the GNI per capita and the employment rates in Saudi Arabia and the difference with the GNI per capita of the Philippines, and to look at actual migration pattern from the Philippines to Saudi Arabia and many other countries and the like. Okay? Right. So we still have time. So I'll already begin our discussion of capital and finance in economic development. Now, when we talk of capital and finance, okay, we're talking here about money. And we'll have to look at money demand and the money supply aspect of money. When you talk of money, especially in a modern, money is anything that's able to perform the two basic types of functions. First, money is anything that would be useful as a medium of exchange. And then, money would also be anything that's useful as a store of value. As a medium of exchange, what this means is that uh, uh, human beings are not after money. They need the money in order to obtain the goods and services. And that's why it's a medium of exchange, a means for a buyer to be able to purchase goods from a seller. So by transactions demand for money, money is not the one that is attractive. It's they're aiming for the goods, and money is simply useful for purposes of obtaining and selling the goods. But money is also a store of value. To say that money by itself is value, it can increase its purchasing power over time. So money therefore has this dual characteristic. It's a necessity, it's a medium of exchange because one needs money in order to obtain the goods and services. And money by itself can be attractive. It has value itself, can increase its purchasing power. Okay? So you have two types of demand for money. You have the transactions demand for money and the speculative demand for money. Moreover, money comes in a variety of forms. Okay? The most basic form of money is called M1, where M1 is currency in circulation, CC, or cash. And then you have demand deposits or the checking accounts, where these demand deposits or checking accounts are as good as cash. And the bulk of transactions is not in actual cash, currency in circulation, but rather in terms of demand deposits, in terms of checks. A characteristic, in fact, of developed countries is that the higher the level of GNI per capita, the lesser the share of currency in circulation, the total supply of money. And then there's M2, which is equal to M1 plus savings and time deposits. Okay. For savings and time deposits are liquid, they can be used for transactions purposes, but they must first be converted into M1, either into a checking account or cash. But by themselves, savings and time deposits already have a medium of exchange function. But more than that, they now have the store of value function because the savings and time deposits are interest earning the way demand deposits are now. And then there's M3, which is M2 plus reverse repurchase papers, which we'll discuss later on. Okay? And as I mentioned to you, a characteristic of developed economies is the higher degrees of monetization of transactions. And many developed countries have several M's, meaning to say a wide range of money substitutes, meaning to say assets, which are able to function as medium of exchange and also value. So they reach up to MA also, including things like, say, bonds, stocks, and the like. Now, so the demand for money there are two main types. There's the transactions demand, which is generally stable, because it's really a demand for money in order to obtain goods and services. That is generally stable when you're talking here about the supply and demand for goods. But the speculative demand for money can be the unpredictable one, because when you're talking here about speculative demand for money, it means the demand for money as money appears in many different forms. And the different forms that money appears in have different levels of risk and yield. Okay? So, for example, when you're talking of a speculative demand for money, it will involve a demand not so much for cash, but more like, for example, a demand for bank deposits. Or the funds could shift to bonds, which are government issued debts, or they could shift to commercial papers, which are debts issued by private establishments. Then you have equities, or what in ordinary language you know of as shares of stock. And then you also have foreign exchange, plus bank deposits, bonds, commercial papers, and equities and foreign money, and a wider range of financial assets. And each of these, bank deposits, bonds, commercial papers, have different yields, meaning to say different interest earnings, and different levels of risk. Generally, the higher the rate of return, the greater is the risk. Risk in terms of changes and its value. Like, for example, the risk involved in price changes in stocks in terms of equities and the like. For all those of you who are still very young, if you like to build your asset until you're ready for your retirement in 30, 40 years' time, the highest long-term rate of return is in stocks, which is why if you have some savings right now, and quite substantial amount of savings, if you purchase stocks with those savings and just keep them there and let them remain for the next 30 to 40 years, okay, then the rate of return will be very high. So some stocks that you purchase now for 10,000 pesos in 30, 40 years time, conceivably be anywhere from 750 to 2 million pesos, 30 to 40 years time. So that becomes part of your nest egg when you retire. So stocks have the longest long run rate of return. If you keep on purchasing stock and selling it for cash and back and forth, you are negating the realization of the long-term uh, rate of return on stocks. The idea behind stocks is just purchase them now, and their value will just keep on increasing over the next 30 to 40 years. Of course, there'll be short-run changes in volatility, but 30 to 40 years from now, the value of those stocks will be far higher than what they would be today. Now, here's the thing. When you're now talking about demand for money for speculative purposes, the maximization of the value of the assets involve not just a demand for the different types of financial assets, but also demand for real assets. So you do have increasing demand, say, for real estate. Here in the Philippines, you have a lot of condominium developments, where these developments are not primarily meant for people who purchase units to live in them, but rather these are for people who see them as an investment. They purchase units and resell later when there's an increase in the price of these condominium units. Then, of course, you also have this demand, increase in demand for um, for jewelry and metals. And again, there's art and antiques. Then you have commodities. It's not a demand for commodities per se, but rather the demand for purchase contracts on commodities. Like, for example, you have people who purchase forward contracts on, say, rice, where there's a contract for the purchase of rice in 90 days' time at a particular price. And this contract can be sold. So this is what makes the speculative demand for money very, very tricky, because you're talking here about developing a wide range of assets with different securities, with different yields and different levels of risk. And that's why it is said that it's the speculative demand for money, just the main source of, of many of major financial crises since the 90s. Now, on the supply side for money, one needs to understand the structure of the financial system. Okay? Because it's the financial system that is able to create all this wide range of financial assets that can be used for people who would like to maximize the value of their assets, and they'll be purchasing assets of different risk and yield. And many of these were created by the financial system. And when you now talk about the financial system of a modern society, modern economy, you have two basic types of banks that create the supply of money. There's a technical term for the commercial bank, which is a bank that can create or destroy acceptable substitutes to the most basic form of money. These banks, okay, are able to create demand deposits involving the deposits of cash in the banking system, but at the same time, they're able to create acceptable substitutes for cash, like savings deposit, time deposits, and the like. So that's done by the commercial bank. And then the other category of bank in the modern economy is the central bank, whose main function is to control and manage the supply of money. We look at how each of these are able to function. Now, when you talk of a commercial bank, the commercial bank, modern commercial banks, developed a fractional reserve banking system from the Middle Ages. Okay, the original commercial banks were Italian merchants, and they provided essentially what is known as a warehousing service. Okay, meaning to say, many of these merchants uh, provided a warehousing service for a lot of the traders in Italy. Italy was one of the few places in Europe where feudal wars did not emerge. At the end of the Roman Empire, a lot of cities in Italy remained intact. So many of the cities of Italy continued to engage in trade from Western Europe, the Middle East, all the way Far East. And that's why with the trading activities of these Italians, Italian city-states by the medieval have become places where you have all these very wealthy merchants. And the wealth resulted in their accumulation of a lot of gold, since gold was the one commodity accepted in international transactions. So a lot of the Italian merchants therefore had a lot of gold with them, and this physical gold was a bit of a problem in terms of security, right? Which is why the original banks were merchants who had very, very good reputations in gold. They provided a warehousing service for the gold deposits of a lot of the Italian business people. And the warehouse deposits mean that, for example, you deposit with them, say, 10 pounds of gold and then signed by the merchant. So you have a sheet of paper, essentially a warehouse receipt, and whoever has this warehouse receipt, when he now makes purchases, then the sellers are willing to accept that warehouse receipt. There's no need anymore for actual physical gold to be used for payment. And the one who accepted the warehouse receipt can now deposit it in the banks and the bank. Okay. So in time, many of these bankers realized that they actually could earn from their gold holdings, okay, by keeping the quantity of gold as just a fraction of their total deposit liabilities. So oftentimes when they accept deposits, their total deposits, say 1 billion or so, the actual gold that they hold in reserve is just a fraction, 10%. And the reason why there's widespread acceptance of the warehouse receipt in place of the gold is the trust that the community has on the bankers. Okay? A trust that is so important, and it explains, for example, the use of the term bank. Bank comes from the Italian word for a bench, in banco, okay? Because the bankers were regarded as very, very much respected people in the community. That's why they were allowed to set up their benches in the public squares, the piazzas, to transact banking businesses. And when you have a banker that therefore was discovered to have, say, mismanaged the funds and lost the gold, like you have this special ceremony by which they smash the bench of the banker so that he no longer is allowed to engage in banking service. Okay. Smashing the bench, of course, means banco rupto, from which we get the word bankrupt. And with the fractional reserve banking, not only would be the warehouse receipt signed by a banker being accepted as medium of exchange, in time many of the bankers developed correspondence relationships. So say a banker in Florence who issues the warehouse receipts, it would be acceptable to a business person based in Venice. And he just presents it to a banker in Venice who has close correspondent ties with the other banker in Florence. And they were able to therefore facilitate the movement of goods and cash from Florence to Venice and so on. It was these Italian bankers that therefore also developed double entry bookkeeping, the foundation of modern accounting, and they were the ones that adopted the much more simplified Arabic numerals. The Italians call them Arabic because they first saw it among the Arabs, and in fact, the Arabs actually first obtained it in India. So it might be more correct to call it the Indian numerals. Okay. So capitalism expanded throughout the rest of Western Europe because Italian merchants and bankers provided credit to European landlords to produce and export basic commodities and to purchase imported goods. The trading was facilitated by the ease of banking transactions of goods like wool, glass, porcelain, silk, spices, armaments, and the like, which is why I say a trader in Paris, okay, if they're going to sell goods in Paris to be sold, say, somewhere in Spain or Italy, no longer needed to take in gold as payment in terms of the physical transfer of gold from Spain to Paris. Rather, it will they will just be trading using these sheets of paper, these warehouse receipts, which will then be recorded in the ledgers of bankers in Paris and in Spain. And therefore, the banks, by creating these acceptable substitutes for gold, they greatly facilitated the movement of goods and services and therefore the greater commercialization of agriculture so that more and more of the landed estates in Europe were now engaged in production of goods for sale. And the earnings would then be deposited with the banks, and then the banks provided loans from these. Okay? And the banks developed correspondent relationships with each other that made it easy for funds to move with just the movement of these warehouse receipts, and therefore made it possible for goods and people to move around. Okay. Now, central banking. I will discuss central banking in our next class. It's only about 8 p.m. So right now, are there any questions or so? Because if there are none, in our next class, I'll proceed with the further discussion of the expansion of the capital and finance and its role in long-term economic development. And then I move towards a discussion of international trade and economic development. Okay. So if there are no questions or comments, I'd say what? Good evening. Okay. Good night to all of you. I will see
Thank
you
you, sir.
next
Thank you,
week.
sir.
Thank
Okay.
you,
Thank you,
sir.
sir. Good
My
night.
pleasure. Good night. Bye
Thank you
bye.
po.
Bye.